Hi, so welcome to this Facebook Live, another Facebook Live about the inner critic. And this is part of a series of lives that I'm making, which is all about the inner critic that we all have and learning to become aware of that and work with it in a way where we can be free of it. And this live today is going to focus on the origins of the critic. So we'll be discovering a little bit where the critic comes from, how it develops, and how that can enable us to have more awareness of it and actually be more free of it. So those of you who've been watching this series of lives will probably already have an awareness of what your critic is like the things your critic says and the characteristics of your critic. And for some of you, you may have noticed that that reminds you of someone from your early life. So it's pretty common when people do these types of exercises to find that their critic reminds them of a parent or a caregiver or a teacher. Someone who was in that role of guardianship when you were younger. So it kind of seems like you've internalized some judgments that you experienced when you were young. So let's look a little bit more at that and why that happens. So when we are children, when all of us are children, we're reliant on our parents for love and actually for survival. We look to our caregivers for our needs. And there's no other option for a child. So a child naturally learns to shape themselves into the way that they can be loved by their parents. So this is perfectly natural human response. And because humans are brilliant at learning, when we're young, it's natural that we mold ourselves to behave in a way that gets us love, and to avoid behaving in a way that gets us into trouble, that gets the love removed. So this is subtly going on a level in every child. And part of the mechanism that is developed in order to do this is self-criticism. So we judge ourselves internally before the judgment and criticism and withdrawal of love comes from our caregivers. So it's actually a very intelligent mechanism, this ability to internalize the criticism that we're getting from our caregivers so that we can make ourselves behave in a way that gets us love. So in doing this, we're taking on the values of our parents. And within that, because our parents are within society, we're taking on the values of society. And we're shaping ourselves. And this self-criticism, self-judgment is part of what shapes us as we grow. It's part of what eggs us on to be that image of perfection, of what is held internally of how we should be. And it can be a real driving force. It can be what's fueling a lot in our lives to grow and perform and succeed. So it's an important aspect that is within all of us. And as long as you're unaware of this, as long as you're unaware of what you swallowed whole from your caregivers, then this gets projected outwards. So there can be a sense of so much is expected of me by society, by people around me, by my friends, by my boss, by my partner. There's all of this pressure on me, like where is it coming from? And the realization that actually often a lot of these ideas of how you should be in the world, how you should be, are actually held internally and have been carried with us since we were very young. So we learn to judge ourselves to avoid the judgment of our parents, of our caregivers. And the more unpleasant the responses of our parents, the more fierce the self-criticism that we develop. So this self-critic, this inner critic, can seem to be a bit like our parents. But the pattern itself, the pattern that we're doing, that we're all doing, is innocent. The critic is actually innocent. They're just trying their best to, it's a mechanism that's developed to protect ourselves. So this way that we beat ourselves up, this process of self-shaming, self-criticism, actually underneath it, there's this deep concern of the child trying to behave in the way where they can be loved. So it often doesn't seem that way when we're grown, and this mechanism is actually quite unhelpful for us. But underneath, there is the anxiety of the child to be the right way, to be loved. And this is often why it's so difficult to break these patterns, because within them there is the child who's attached to the parents. Even if we don't like our parents, there's a very young part of us that's attached, that's reliant. And on a deep unconscious level, the letting go of this process of self-criticism can feel, to that very young place in us, like a risk of abandonment, of risking not being loved by our parents. So it's very important that when working with a critic, we explore this anxiety, this vulnerability that sits underneath, and get to know it and hold it and make friends with it. So we're going to do a very short little exploration, and probably for this you will have to have been familiar with the disengagement and the things we've already done. So I suggest doing those first if you haven't seen the other lives. And if it's good for you, if it's okay for you, I suggest just closing your eyes for a moment, just as a way of dropping in. And just letting yourself land a little bit in your body. Maybe taking a few sighs. And just noticing what's here. Noticing that you have feet, that you have hands. The feelings of this body. And then tuning into a sense of your critic right now. Like, are they active? Just in the way you're sitting, is your critic criticizing you for the way that you're doing this process? Or maybe they're quiet right now. And if that's the case, just remembering a time when there was self-criticism happening. Kind of tuning into a sense of that. And with it, a kind of sense of the character of your critic. Things that your critic says, and even their posture, maybe the way they look. Sense of this critic being beside you. And then noticing your reaction to the critic. particularly what happens in your body in response to criticism. And noting that reaction, and then allowing yourself to step out of that, to witness it. So the reaction can be there, and you can just notice, knowing that in this process we're not going to be giving any more power to the critic. Just going to become curious about it. So the reaction can be there, can be present, and see if, stepped out of the reaction, you can allow yourself to be a little curious about this critical voice. Just kind of noticing them, extending your curiosity, maybe letting them know that you're curious. And see how your critic responds. So, if they respond with their normal criticism, throwing their judgments, maybe they get very quiet. What happens when you extend your attention towards your critic without reactivity, just with a curiosity of what's there? And with however your critic is responding right now, if it's okay for you, just asking them the question, what they're scared might happen if they stopped this barrage of criticism that they so frequently throw towards you. What are they afraid might happen if they stop their self-criticism? And notice what you get back. Maybe they're still critical, or they've gone quiet, or maybe within your sense of the critic somehow you can tune into their response to that question. What they're scared of actually underneath might happen. And if you have a sense of that, then letting your critic know that you hear them. And it might not make sense. Just listening to what your critic is scared of. And you may have a sense that there may have been times when actually it made sense, that there was a real threat of what your critic was scared of. And if that's the case, you can even extend some appreciation for what they did back then, for how they were trying their best to get you through difficult times early on in your life. So just being curious with whatever comes. If they're still critical or just silent, really listening to the critic, seeing what you discover. And then letting them know that it's time to come back. And finding your own way to come back to yourself. And maybe moving your body a little, and when it's good for you, opening your eyes. And just allowing yourself the space to be with whatever that touch is within you. Oftentimes there is deep vulnerability under this very critical voice. And I know this because I've experienced a very critical voice within me, and then underneath that there's deep vulnerability, just that young one who so wants to be loved, so wants to perform the right way to get love. So I hope you've enjoyed this little inquiry, and if you liked it, maybe share it a little on Facebook. I think it's really good to get the word out about inner critics. I think the more people who know about it, the better, probably. And I'll be back in a few days with another live, and we're going to start to look a little bit about shadow and the inner critic, to look at the energies that the critic blocks us from, and the energies that we can engage with that actually will bring freedom from this pattern of self-shaming.